At 2:11 in the morning, I watched the last thing my father and I ever built together burn straight into the lake. By the time I ran outside barefoot, my private dock was already engulfed. Flames were racing across 22 years of weathered cedar, curling around the boat lift, chewing through the little tool shed at the end, and throwing orange light across Briar Lake. I ran for the emergency pump beside the shoreline, pulled the starter. Nothing. I tried again, still nothing. Then I saw the water line lying in the grass. It had been cut clean through. Not cracked, not burned, cut. Someone had made sure I couldn't fight the fire. By sunrise, the dock was gone, and HOA president Vanessa Crowley was standing behind the fire tape in a cream-colored coat and designer sunglasses. Telling my neighbors it was probably old wiring. Then she walked straight up to me and handed me a notice. 72 hours. That was how long Cedar Ridge HOA was giving me to authorize its contractors to remove the burned wreckage from my shoreline. My shoreline property that had never belonged to Cedar Ridge. That was the moment something stopped making sense. The fire wasn't the end of whatever they were doing. It was cleanup. What Vanessa didn't know was that about 70 feet uphill. Hidden inside an old pine tree was a security camera she'd never noticed, and somehow it had survived. I didn't confront her. I didn't mention the camera. I went inside, locked the door. Pulled the memory card, and made 4 copies, because the footage didn't just show who came to my dock that night. It showed what they removed from beneath it 11 minutes before they set it on fire. And once I learned where that pipe led, losing my dock became the smallest problem Cedar Ridge had. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 47 years old, and most of my career has been spent in marine construction, docks, retaining walls, shoreline stabilization, stormwater systems. It's the kind of work nobody notices when it's done correctly, but when something is wrong, you learn to see it fast. My property sits on the western edge of Briar Lake. Cedar Ridge Estate surrounds most of that side of the water. But my parcel isn't part of it. My father bought the land almost 20 years before Cedar Ridge existed. When developers eventually built the subdivision, they wrapped homes, roads and common areas around us. But our deed never changed. We never joined the HOA. Vanessa Crowley hated that. She had been Cedar Ridge's president for 12 years. And whenever a property line got in the way of what she called community planning, she treated it like a clerical error waiting to be corrected. The dock was probably the thing she hated most. My father and I built it together when I was 25. He was a carpenter, the sort of man who could spend 20 minutes measuring a board, cut it perfectly, then measure the next one for 20 minutes too. Every piling had his handwriting somewhere on it. Every repaired railing reminded me of a summer afternoon. He died 6 years before the fire, so when I stood in my yard watching that dock collapse into the lake, I wasn't thinking about insurance. I was watching one of the last things we'd made together disappear. Fire Chief Nolan Briggs arrived before 3. He was quiet. That was one reason I trusted him. He walked the remains without making a show of it. First the shore, then the tool shed, then the boat lift, then back toward the shore again. 3 locations, 3 separate burn patterns. When he finally came back to me, he lowered his voice. "Don't touch anything," that was all he said. Vanessa arrived a few hours later. Perfect hair, perfect coat, a thick HOA folder under one arm. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "We've warned people for years about old electrical systems near the water. No one had ever warned me about anything." She knew it. Then she handed me the notice. The burned dock, according to Cedar Ridge, now represented a visual and environmental hazard. Their contractors were prepared to remove it immediately. I looked at the page, then at her. "You don't have jurisdiction here." Her smile didn't move. "We have shoreline obligations. My shoreline for community safety." There it was. Community safety. Vanessa's favorite phrase whenever she wanted control over something that wasn't hers. I folded the notice and put it in my pocket. I didn't argue, because while she was still talking, I remembered the small black camera mounted in the pine tree above the hill, and suddenly nothing Vanessa said mattered anymore. The camera had been there for almost a year, not because of the HOA. I'd installed it after someone kept leaving beer cans around the shoreline during summer weekends. It was cheap. Battery-powered, pointed mostly toward the dock. The fire never reached the tree. At 8:43 that morning, after the firefighters had cleared the property, I climbed up and removed the memory card. I copied the files onto my computer, then an external drive, then a second drive. Then cloud storage. My father used to say, if somebody wants one copy gone, give them four. The first useful clip began at 1:41 a.m. A white utility truck rolled down the service road with its headlights off. Cedar Ridge Estates was printed on the door. 3 men got out. Their faces weren't clear enough to identify, but I could see what they were doing. One walked toward my emergency pump. At 1:53, he crouched beside it. Seconds later, he stood up holding a section of dark hose, my water line. Another man carried 2 red fuel cans toward the dock. That alone ended any theory about faulty wiring. But I kept watching. At 1:58, all 3 men moved underneath the dock, and instead of setting the fire, they started digging. For almost 4 minutes, they worked at the softened shoreline. Then 2 of them dragged something long and black out of the mud, a section of pipe about 6 feet long, industrial grade, large enough to carry serious stormwater. They loaded it into the HOA truck. At 2:03, one man walked the length of the dock carrying a fuel can. At 2:09, the first flame appeared. At 2:11, my bedroom window lit orange. I watched the footage again, then again. By the third replay, the fire was no longer the mystery. The pipe was, because I had seen it before 3 days earlier, and Vanessa Crowley had already told me in writing that it didn't exist. 3 days before the fire, Briar Lake got hammered by a storm, 4 inches of rain in one afternoon. The next morning I walked down to check erosion around the dock pilings. That's what somebody in my line of work does after heavy rain. You look at the dirt. Near the north side of the dock, part of the shoreline had washed away. Something black was sticking out of the exposed bank. At first I thought it was an old drainage sleeve. Then I knelt down 8-inch pipe, modern material, recent installation, running directly through my property. I took 6 photographs. Then I checked its direction northeast toward the Cedar Ridge clubhouse and maintenance yard. That afternoon I emailed Vanessa. One question: who installed the discharge line beneath my dock? Her reply came 27 minutes later. There is no HOA infrastructure on your property. Please refrain from making unsupported accusations involving association facilities. I saved the email. At the time, I thought she was covering for some unauthorized drainage work. After the fire, that email became much more important. The camera showed Cedar Ridge workers removing the exact section I'd photographed. Then burning the structure above it, I enlarged the old pictures. There was a faded blue marking along one side, a contractor code. I recognized the manufacturer. More importantly, I recognized the pipe. It wasn't designed for residential drainage. It was commercial stormwater pipe. I pulled up the county's utility maps. Nothing. No approved line. No drainage easement. No stormwater connection crossing my parcel. I checked the original subdivision plat, still nothing. Then I traced the most likely route using elevation maps and satellite images. Straight from my shoreline, straight towards Cedar Ridge's clubhouse, a pipe that officially did not exist, installed beneath land the HOA did not own, removed just minutes before that land was set on fire. That wasn't a maintenance problem, that was evidence. For the next 2 days, I lived at the county records office. That sounds boring until somebody burns your property. Then, paperwork becomes very interesting. I pulled every recorded document tied to my parcel and Cedar Ridge estates. My deed, the subdivision plat, utility easements, road easements, shoreline agreements, stormwater permits. My father had kept copies of most of them in a steel file box. The county versions matched his. My shoreline belonged to me. No HOA access, no drainage easement, no maintenance rights. Nothing then. A county clerk named Susan found something unusual. A document submitted 3 years earlier by Cedar Ridge. The title read, Shoreline Management Easement. It showed a narrow strip crossing my land exactly where the pipe had been installed. According to the document, Cedar Ridge had permanent rights to access and maintain stormwater infrastructure along that section of the lake. There was one problem. I had never signed it. Neither had my father. The document carried what looked like an official county recording stamp, but the reference number attached to it went nowhere. Suzanne checked twice. Then a third time that number doesn't exist. The stamp looked legitimate. The filing wasn't. I requested a certified copy. Then I searched Cedar Ridge's old planning applications to see where else the map had appeared. That's when the story changed again. The fake easement wasn't sitting forgotten in some HOA filing cabinet. Cedar Ridge had used it. 3 years earlier, the association had submitted it as part of an environmental improvement project. Attached to the application was a funding award, $1.8 million. Now I had a different question. If Cedar Ridge had received nearly $2 million to build a legal environmental protection system, why was there a secret pipe buried under my dock? The grant itself made sense. Cedar Ridge had expanded quickly. More houses meant more roads meant more pavement, and more pavement meant runoff carrying fuel. Fertilizer, cleaning chemicals, and sediment toward Briar Lake. The project proposal promised a complete stormwater filtration system, collection basins, oil water separators. Vegetation buffers, controlled discharge. According to Cedar Ridge's final report, the system had been completed 18 months earlier, paid for, inspected, operational, except I had spent years building real stormwater systems. And an 8-inch pipe buried beneath somebody else's private dock was not one. I started following the payments. Most of the construction money had gone to a company called Crowley Shoreline Services. The registered owner was Peter Crowley, Vanessa's brother-in-law. That alone wasn't proof of anything. Family businesses work for HOAs all the time, but then I started comparing invoices. Equipment that should have cost tens of thousands had been billed for hundreds of thousands. A filtration unit supposedly installed near the clubhouse didn't appear on any current site plan. One invoice charged Cedar Ridge $94,000 for excavation at a location that showed no evidence of ever being excavated. The paperwork described a sophisticated environmental protection system. The ground suggested something much cheaper, a pipe, straight downhill, straight into the lake, and the discharge point sat beneath my dock. Then the timing clicked into place. 3 days before a scheduled inspection, I had emailed Vanessa a photograph of the exposed pipe. 2 nights later, Cedar Ridge's maintenance truck arrived at my property. The crew removed the visible section. Then they burned the dock above it. The fire wasn't meant to erase the entire history of the pipe. It didn't need to. It only needed to create enough chaos, ash, debris, emergency cleanup. A reason for Cedar Ridge contractors to dig up the shoreline before an inspector saw what I had seen, and Vanessa had handed me a cleanup authorization less than 6 hours after the fire. I never signed it. Instead, I called the State Environmental Office. The inspector assigned to the complaint was Rachel Kim. I didn't give her my theory. I showed her the photographs. Then the county maps. Then the camera footage. The moment the video reached the pipe, she stopped me. "Play that again." I did. She watched it twice. 2 days later, her office collected soil and sediment samples around the remains of my dock. The preliminary results came back fast. Petroleum residue, concentrated herbicide, industrial cleaning solvent. Not enough yet to prove exactly how long the discharge had been happening. More than enough to justify a larger investigation. Vanessa found out about the inspection almost immediately, and her reaction told me she was scared. 3 letters arrived in 1 week. The first declared my shoreline unsafe. The second demanded emergency access for HOA personnel. The third threatened legal action because I was supposedly interfering with community drainage infrastructure. Think about that. First, Vanessa told me there was no HOA infrastructure on my property. Now her lawyers were threatening me for interfering with it. Then she called an emergency HOA meeting. I went. Not because I belonged to Cedar Ridge. I went because half the neighborhood had suddenly been told that I was the one threatening their lake. Vanessa stood at the front beside a projector. Mr. Mercer has made a series of increasingly extreme accusations against this association. She called me hostile, uncooperative, obsessed. Then she told the room I was using the fire to extort Cedar Ridge. People turned around to stare at me. I didn't stand. I didn't argue. I wrote down every word. After the meeting, I headed toward my truck. A man followed me into the parking lot. Martin Hale, Cedar Ridge's treasurer. He looked pale. He kept glancing back toward the clubhouse doors. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Vanessa told us the pipe was legal. I waited. He swallowed. She told us the grant paid for everything. Then he handed me a flash drive. You need to see what she made us approve. Martin had been treasurer for 4 years. He wasn't completely innocent. His signature appeared on invoices. His approval appeared on budget reports. But according to him, Vanessa controlled the entire environmental project. She selected the contractor. She communicated with inspectors. She supplied the board with copies of the permits. Martin assumed someone else had verified them. The flash drive contained years of board packets. Invoices, emails, and scanned approvals. Some documents were legitimate. Others weren't. One inspection letter used the correct state agency logo but named an employee who had retired years before the date on the letter. Several Crowley Shoreline Services invoices had been approved before the work supposedly happened. Then I found an email from Vanessa to Cedar Ridge maintenance manager, Wade Keller. It had been sent 5 days before the fire. One sentence: the Mercer obstruction needs to be removed before inspection, that was all. No mention of gasoline, no order to burn anything. But it proved Vanessa knew something on my property threatened the inspection. Then Martin showed me another payment, issued 2 days after the fire. Emergency shoreline remediation. $38,500, payable to Crowley Shoreline Services. They had already billed Cedar Ridge for cleaning up my property before I'd authorized anyone to step onto it. That was when the investigation moved beyond environmental regulators. Because some of the project money came through federal funding, the people asking questions changed. They didn't attend HOA meetings. They didn't argue with Vanessa. They subpoenaed things: accounts, phones, servers, contractor records. For the first time since the fire, I stopped dealing with people Vanessa could intimidate, and started dealing with people who could force her to answer. The investigators made one decision I appreciated immediately. They didn't tell Vanessa about my camera. Not yet. They interviewed her first. Vanessa said no Cedar Ridge employee had been on my property the night of the fire. She said the maintenance truck never left the HOA yard. Wade Keller gave the same story. 2 interviews. Same lie. Then investigators checked the truck's GPS data. It left the maintenance yard at 1:34 a.m., reached my property at 1:41, returned at 2:27. Wade's phone placed him near my shoreline during the same window. Then investigators recovered deleted messages. Most were meaningless. One wasn't. It had been sent from Vanessa to Wade at 1:32 that morning. 3 words: clear it tonight, by itself. That message didn't say how. Combined with everything else, it didn't have to. The camera, the fuel cans, the cut water line, the missing pipe, the fake easement, the invoices, the false statements. The case was closing around her. Vanessa didn't know it. She still believed the fire had destroyed the most important evidence, so she did what people like Vanessa always do when control starts slipping away. She got louder. Another emergency meeting was announced. This time, Cedar Ridge claimed I had sabotaged community infrastructure and created an environmental hazard. The board would vote on legal action against me. Vanessa wanted an audience. She wanted to put me on trial in front of the entire neighborhood. What she didn't know was that investigators had chosen the same night to visit Cedar Ridge. They just weren't coming to vote. The community center was packed, more than 100 residents. Vanessa stood behind the microphone with a thick binder open in front of her. I sat in the last row. Martin wasn't seated with the board. He sat near the exit. Vanessa began with the fire. She called it tragic. Then she called my behavior reckless. Mr. Mercer has obstructed lawful environmental infrastructure. She said. He has refused access, spread false allegations, and interfered with systems legally maintained by this association. I let her talk. Then she put the fake shoreline easement on the projector. The same document with the recording number that didn't exist. She pointed directly at the line crossing my property. This document proves Cedar Ridge's rights. A few residents nodded. Then the back doors opened. 3 people entered, 2 federal investigators, and Rachel Kim from the environmental office. Vanessa stopped speaking, just for a second. Then she smiled. Can I help you? One investigator walked toward the front. Vanessa Crowley? Yes, we need you to step away from the computer. Her smile disappeared. This is a private association meeting. No, ma'am. The second investigator handed documents to one of the remaining board members. At the same time, officers moved into the hallway leading toward Cedar Ridge's records room. The room started buzzing. Vanessa pointed toward me. This is him. He's been harassing this board for weeks. I stayed seated. The lead investigator placed a folder on the table. Mrs. Crowley, during your interview, did you state that no Cedar Ridge employee visited Daniel Mercer's property on the night of the fire? Vanessa looked toward her attorney. I answered your questions. Did you make that statement? Her attorney stood. Vanessa, don't answer. The investigator gave a small nod. Then he opened the folder, he removed a photograph and placed it on the table. Even from the back row, I knew exactly what it was, the Cedar Ridge truck beside my dock timestamp. 1:41 a.m., another photograph. Wade beside my emergency pump, another 2 red fuel cans. Then the last one. 3 men dragging the black pipe from underneath my dock. Vanessa stared at the picture. Then she looked across the room at me, and that was the exact moment she understood. The camera survived. For the first time since I'd known Vanessa Crowley, she had absolutely nothing to say. Residents began shouting, "What pipe? Why was Wade there? What were they dumping?" The investigator raised his voice. Everyone remained seated. Vanessa reached toward her binder. An officer moved between her and the table. "Don't touch that." Then Wade Keller appeared in the doorway. Another officer beside him. His hands were behind his back. Vanessa's face went white. Her lawyer leaned close and whispered something. She shook her head. The investigator explained that a search warrant covered Cedar Ridge's offices. Electronic records, financial accounts, and project documentation connected to the stormwater project. Another warrant covered Crowley Shoreline Services. Then he looked at Vanessa. Mrs. Crowley, turn around." Somebody in the second row gasped. The handcuffs clicked loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Vanessa kept repeating the same sentence. "This is a misunderstanding." Nobody answered. The records room was sealed. Yellow evidence tape went across the door. Behind Vanessa, the projector was still displaying the fake shoreline easement. My property. My dock. Their forged line running straight through both. For years, Vanessa had convinced people that putting authority on paper made it real. That night, a single photograph from a camera hidden in a pine tree destroyed the illusion. The investigation lasted months, and the final case went far beyond my dock. Investigators uncovered evidence connected to the fire, destruction of evidence, false environmental filings. Forged property documents, illegal discharge, misuse of project funds, and undisclosed financial relationships between Cedar Ridge and its contractors. Vanessa wasn't the only person caught in it. Wade was charged. Peter Crowley's company became part of the investigation. Several board members resigned. Martin cooperated. Cedar Ridge was temporarily placed under outside administration while contracts. Liens and financial records from Vanessa's tenure were reviewed. The fake shoreline easement disappeared first, then questionable fines. Then the emergency access rules Vanessa had used for years to push onto property she didn't control. The hidden drainage line was excavated. The real stormwater system had to be built correctly. Briar Lake required remediation. It cost Cedar Ridge a lot of money, but something happened that mattered more. For the first time, the residents could see where their money was going. Meetings became transparent. Major contracts required independent review. Financial documents went online. The new board asked me to join. I declined. I already have a full-time job, I told them. Keeping people honest shouldn't be one. It took me 7 months to rebuild the dock. I could have hired a crew. I didn't. I rebuilt most of it myself. Same footprint, same kind of cedar my father had used. There was one blackened plank from the old dock that I managed to save. It was too damaged to use structurally. So I mounted it inside the new tool shed. Underneath it I put a small brass plate, 3 lines, built with Dad, burned by liars, rebuilt with the truth, the first evening after I finished the final railing. I sat at the end of the dock until sunset. One of the neighbors came down with his grandson. The boy asked if he could fish. I handed him one of my father's old rods, and for the first time in months, Briar Lake was quiet. No maintenance trucks, no lawyers, no emergency meetings, no notices taped to my mailbox. Just water against the pilings. People have asked me whether I regret not confronting Vanessa the moment I saw the camera footage. I don't. People like Vanessa knows how to survive confrontation. They want you angry, they want you shouting, they want you emotional enough that they can point at you and say you're the problem. So I gave her none of that. I gave her time. Time to lie. Time to send letters. Time to approve payments. Time to repeat the same story to investigators. And time to convince herself that every piece of evidence had burned with my dock. It hadn't. Because sometimes the loudest thing in the room isn't the person holding the microphone. Sometimes it's a tiny memory card sitting quietly in somebody's pocket. And sometimes, when someone is digging their own hole, the smartest thing you can do is stop interrupting and let them keep digging.